Hi everyone. Good evening. My name is Roxy and I'm the bilingual program liaison at the Latimer House Museum. For those who cannot see me, I'm an East Asian woman with short black hair and a green mid-sleeve dress. I'm joined by our intern Julia, who will be helping us tonight, and our speaker, Dr. Meredith Linn. Our topic of tonight's talk is exploring hidden African American history, specifically on the history of Seneca Village, known as Central Park in present day. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hopes of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We are on the ancestral lands of the Lenape people. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here tonight. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. Here are a few links I'll share in the chat for more information about the Lenape people. I'd also like to take a minute to introduce our museum. So as you can see in my back, that is actually how the house looks like in spring. The Latimer House Museum was the home to Black inventor Louis Latimer from 1903 to 1928 in Flushing, Queens. He contributed to modern technologies, including early elevator system, bathrooms and railroad carts, the telephone, and most notably, the carbon filament light bulb. And we're proud to present tonight's program in partnership with the Bird Homestead and Meeting House Conservancy, an all-volunteer nonprofit in Rye, New York. The organization is dedicated to preserving the Bird Homestead, Rye Meeting House, and the Voris archaeological site, three adjoining historic properties located on the banks of Blind Brook estuary, and to conserving their coastal habitat and biodiversity while producing educational programs for the public. And I want to take a minute right now to share with you all. This is how the Rye Meeting House looks like. I'll read more thoroughly of what this is. So this building, now known as the Rye Meeting House, served as a chapel in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1959, the Religious Society of Friends purchased it for use as a meeting house, highlighting the Quaker principles of peace, equality, and stewardship of the earth. The building is now secular and operated by the Conservancy. The Rye Meeting House has received statewide awards for excellence in historic preservation and excellence in education. This month, professional archaeologists, with the help of volunteers, are excavating the sites of two 19th century buildings owned by William Voris, an African-American entrepreneur. Our program tonight is funded in part by Humanities New York. Before we start, after this introduction, we will hear a presentation by Dr. Linn, followed by a Q&A session. If you have any questions that you would like to share and for Dr. Linn to answer, please make sure to share them through the Q&A function. We will likely be able to get to 3 to 5 questions depending on the time. There's also an option to upvote any questions should you see your question in the list. Please also feel free to comment, share your thoughts in the chat as the presentation goes. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Linn is the Assistant Professor of Historical Archaeology at the Bard Graduate Center. She holds a Ph.D. from Columbia University, an MA from the University of Chicago, and a BA from Swarthmore College. Her research projects have focused upon the health-related experiences of Irish immigrants in 19th century New York City and upon Seneca Village. Linn was part of the team that excavated Seneca Village and is a co-author with Nan Rothschild and Diana diZerega of the Archaeological Site Report. She has also published articles about both projects and is currently working on a book about each. Without further ado, I'll pass it on to Dr. Linn.
Hello, thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen so I can show you some photos and hopefully this will work. Does that look okay, Roxy?
Yeah, it looks perfect.
Okay, thanks so much. So I'm pleased to join everyone tonight to speak with you a little bit about Seneca Village. And I thank Ann Stillman of the Bird Homestead and Meeting House Conservancy for her gracious invitation, and Roxy Cheng and her colleagues at the Latimer House for their generous offer to include the talk in their programming, and for all of their work coordinating all the logistics of the event tonight. What I'm going to present to you is part of an ongoing research program. So it's a work in progress, and it involves many different people. One might say that researching a village takes a village. And I wish to acknowledge at the outset the leadership of Diana Wall of City College and the CUNY Graduate Center, Nan Rothschild of Barnard College and Columbia University, and Cynthia Copeland of NYU, who are directors of the research program. My fellow assistant director, Herbert Signoret of City College, members of our advisory board, and Marie Warsh and John Reddick and their colleagues at the Central Parks Conservancy, as well as Amanda Sutphin and Jessica McLean at the New York City Archaeological Repository, and many other essential collaborators and contributors. There's, again, a big team involved in this project, including dozens of students who've worked tirelessly researching documents, excavating artifacts, entering data, and more, which is how I initially came to be involved in the project as a graduate student now a long time ago in the early 2000s. So now, with that said, I'll begin with a little bit of background about the beginnings of Seneca Village. In 1825, about 2 years before emancipation in New York State, and in a climate of anti-Black prejudice and violence, a 21-year-old African-American shoeshiner named Andrew Williams and an African-American laborer and trustee of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church named Epiphany Davis each purchased land on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in an area that was about 3.5 miles north of what was then the settled urban core of the city. A few days later, the AME Zion Church itself bought several lots in the same area to use as a burial ground. And within a few years, a few dozen African-American men and women also purchased land there. Some, such as Davis, held their land as an investment or rented it. But many, such as Williams, built their homes, their families, and their lives there. By the early 1840s, European immigrants, mostly from Ireland, began to move into the village, and 2 more churches established congregations and burial grounds: the African Union Methodist Church and All Angels Episcopal Church, which was a racially integrated parish. By 1855, this place, today known as Seneca Village, was the home of over 220 people and contained dozens of houses, a school, planted fields, orchards, and the 3 churches and their cemeteries. And many of these features you can see on this 1855 map. The reddish rectangles and squares are buildings. Here I've labeled the village's 3 churches, as well as Andrew Williams' home and Epiphany Davis's property that I just mentioned. The areas that look like tannish patchwork were planted fields. The gray blobs are bedrock that comes above the ground that's still visible in the park today. This and another map that I'll show you later are very important resources for learning about the village. In 1855, when this map was made, more than half of the African-American households in the village owned property, which was 5 times the rate of property ownership among New Yorkers at large, and a very high rate for the city's African-American population, who faced limited opportunities to amass wealth, as well as racism in their attempts to purchase land in most other parts of the city. But just 2 years after this map was made, the city of New York used the right of eminent domain and an argument about the benefits of a large recreational space in an increasingly populated and polluted city to take land from the residents and to destroy the village to build Central Park. The city also took the land and destroyed the homes of about 1,400 other people, mostly Irish and German immigrants, who lived outside of Seneca Village, but within the lands that became the park. There were protests because even then, taking property from landowners and evicting families was not popular. Many New Yorkers' fortunes, both great and modest, had been built upon real estate. They knew how important land was in creating wealth for themselves and their families. Monetary compensation that was offered to landowners through eminent domain was not sufficient because as speculation drove up real estate prices in the city, equivalent nearby plots became inaccessible. And many landowners complained that they weren't being offered fair prices for their land that they had lived on and improved over time. These issues were magnified for minority landowners, especially African Americans. And for them, property was not only a good investment. After an 1820 law in New York State, $250 also gave African American men voting rights. So political participation was tied to land ownership for African American men. Of course, women of any race were not allowed to vote at this time. Proclaiming the benefits of the park project was thus likely not enough to justify seizing such an important asset from so many people. So some park supporters felt compelled to disparage residents and even the land that they were taking to build the park. In a nutshell, they claimed that the residents were poor squatters or criminals, that their houses were dilapidated and impermanent, and that the land was unproductive and filled with swamps emanating dangerous vapors that made people sick. This was neither the first nor the last time that tropes of disease, dirt, and unproductivity would be used to clear minority neighborhoods. The smear campaign worked, and everyone was forced to depart in 1857. Park construction crews moved in and removed or buried almost any above ground trace of the pre-park built environment. The Seneca Village community didn't reform elsewhere. Residents scattered to different locations throughout mostly the tri-state area. The village quickly faded in public memory and was neglected in New York City histories. So in a sense, it was largely forgotten for decades. But beginning in the 1990s, scholars began to rediscover the history of the village. First, historians Roy Rosenzweig and Elizabeth Blackmar scoured historical documents and maps and published a chapter about the pre-park inhabitants, including Seneca Village, in their book about the history of Central Park in 1992, which you see the cover up on the left of the slide. Then in 1997, Cynthia Copeland and Grady Turner, who had worked with Rosenzweig and Blackmar, co-curated an acclaimed museum exhibition at the New York Historical Society. And you see a picture of part of the exhibit on the right. Shortly afterwards, historical archaeologists Diana Wall and Nan Rothschild, who I mentioned earlier, joined forces with Cynthia Copeland to establish the Seneca Village Project, now known as the longer Institute for the Exploration of Seneca Village History, or IESVH for short, with the idea to investigate the village archaeologically. And I think it's worth pausing a minute to explain why historical archaeology is helpful for learning more about Seneca Village. Today, we're used to having access to all kinds of information about individuals and communities. But before the digital age, people's lives were not so well documented. Obviously, there were no Instagram feeds from Seneca villagers, no Facebook posts, nor home videos, but there aren't even still black and white photographs of what the village looked like, or even a single diary or personal letter from a villager. There are historical documents that pertain to the village, such as censuses, tax records, death records, wills, newspaper articles, maps, and a couple of official letters, but almost none of them were created by Seneca villagers themselves. The vast majority of surviving documents were made by white male clerks who were tasked with recording only certain kinds of information and who were part of a larger system that worked to delegitimize, appropriate, and erase the experiences and contributions of African Americans. This doesn't mean that such surviving documents aren't still informative. It's just that they need to be analyzed with their biases in mind, and they only provide answers to certain kinds of questions. Historical archaeologists use historical documents and archaeological remains together because we see each as providing important pieces of the puzzle. Material remains unearthed in archaeological excavations can reveal new insights into the lives of people who are under or misrepresented in documents, as in the case of Seneca villagers, because material remains are tangible traces of people's own activities and choices. Seemingly ordinary things like the ones you can see on this slide from Seneca Village, such as dishes, bottles, smoking pipes, and food remains are the stuff with which people constructed their homes, their lives, and their identities. Black feminist scholars, most notably Bell Hooks, have long pointed out the vital importance of African-American home places as sites of care, dignity, joy, and resistance to an outside world that actively worked to break up Black families and to deny the equal humanity of people of African descent. By using the tools of historical archaeology, right, texts and objects together viewed through a critical lens, we can and have learned more about Seneca Village families and their home places that we've been sharing with the public to make sure that the village is recognized and remembered as the important 19th century majority African-American community that it was. And tonight I'm going to highlight some of our discoveries that relate to two issues. How Seneca Village was not the poor squatter settlement on unproductive land, as the press depicted it, but in fact, a largely self-supporting, successful community of people who shared middle-class values. And secondly, how some villagers might have shared African diasporic practices and affiliated culturally with one another as African Americans. So after many years of research, lobbying, and testing to find the most promising place to excavate and to be sure to avoid disturbing any burials or any cemeteries in the village, the IESVH finally received permission to excavate in 2011. Wall and Rothschild, assisted by me, a then newly minted Ph.D., and then CUNY Graduate Center student Jenna Copeland, led a team of undergraduate students in limited excavations in 4 areas of the village. Two of those areas ended up really panning out in terms of revealing a lot of artifacts. The Wilson House, which you see up here, and the Webster yard, the Webster and Phillips yard, a shared yard between 2 families. And because of limited time, I'll focus mostly on the Wilsons, but I do want to show you a couple of things about the Webster and Phillips yard. So in the area, in this one area, we uncovered a ground surface of the ground surface of the time in which the village was in use, the time in which people lived in the village, in the backyard between the homes of the Phillips family, who were a young African-American newlywed couple, and the Websters, a larger, more established African-American family of 7. And you can see actually the ground surface in this image where the yellow arrow is pointing. There's a different color of soil within the stratigraphy. What this shows is sort of the current day ground surface where the grass is, and there's a trowel here. And then how we dug a few feet under the ground and what the different layers of soil look like. And this layer of soil here contained a lot of artifacts and also was different in color and texture, and that indicated that it was the surface upon which Seneca villagers had actually walked. Also in here, this big rock actually is a rock left behind by retreating glaciers 10,000 years ago. So sometimes you find sort of unexpected geological features in addition to artifacts when digging. Many of the artifacts that we found in this area, and that I'm showing you a couple on this slide, were related to dining and to serving tea. And they showed that residents were up to date on the latest ceramic fashions, including gilded porcelain and plain white molded teaware that was also popular among the white middle class in New York. This pattern of fashionable dishes, finding lots of fashionable dishes, also held true in the other main area that we excavated in the village, the Wilson House. In this area, we found the ruins of a 3-story house that had once belonged to William Godfrey Wilson, an African-American porter and the sexton of the nearby All Angels Church, as well as his wife, Charlotte Morris Wilson, and their 9 children. And we know this was the site of their home because we have a different map made by Gardner Sage, who was tasked with creating maps of all the properties in the lands that were to become the park so that the city could try to understand how much properties might be worth and what belonged to who, so they could figure out how to compensate people for taking their land. So in this very informative map, we see that this house belongs to William Godfrey Wilson, and we were able to overlay this historic map with current day maps of the park and aerial photos to be sure that the place that we dug in the ground was actually the site where this house was. And here you can see a couple of the many remains that we found while excavating in this area, and the ones that I've selected to put on this slide attest to the ways in which the Wilsons made use of local resources. On the far right, you can see the remains of the foundation of their home. These stones are of the same type that are found throughout the park. They are schist, which is the bedrock in Manhattan, which is different from gneiss, G-N-E-I-S-S, which is the bedrock in the Bronx. And so you can tell people that the Bronx is gneiss, but Manhattan is schist. Moving on from bad geology jokes. All right, anyhow, so this is, we can see that they've made good use of the local stones in the area to build the foundation of their house. The upper stories of their house would have been wood, and it's possible that they took those with them when they moved. The Wilsons are one family that we have been able to trace well in terms of what happened to them after the park was built. They moved to the west side, further to the west side, along with All Angels Church, where Mr. Wilson remained the sexton for many years. On the bottom left, you can see a fishing weight that the Wilsons might have used to catch fish in the nearby Hudson River, which is only a few blocks away from the site, as well as one of many oyster shells we found, which the Wilsons could have also collected in the river. It's also possible, of course, that they could have acquired the oysters from many oyster vendors in New York City. New York City was known for its oysters, and African Americans played prominent roles in all aspects of oystering in the 19th century. And I can talk about this more in the Q&A if you'd like. On the top of the slide in the middle here is a jawbone of a sheep goat. I say a sheep goat because without DNA testing, it's impossible even for experts to tell the difference between these two animals by the form of their bones alone. Sheep goat were the most prominent animal among the faunal remains at the Wilson house and in the yard shared by the Websters and the Phillipses. And other faunal remains included bones from pigs, cows, birds, and fish. The presence of many different parts of each of these animals, literally from head to toe, suggests that they were raised and butchered within the village. Sheep, goats, and cows were likely grazed in rocky portions of the village, those areas with the rock outcroppings that I showed you in the map that were less suitable for agriculture. Similarly, the locations of standing water after rain that we observed during our excavations correlated with areas on the VLA map that I showed you where there were planted fields, suggesting that villagers made productive use of wetter areas of the village for agriculture. Plant remains were unfortunately not so well preserved at the site. We would have really liked to have known what kinds of things villagers were growing, but plant remains are fragile, so it's sort of not unexpected that they wouldn't be well preserved. We did find some, though, including seeds from elder trees, which you can see in the slide here, just a sort of present day photo of some elderberries, which are used for pies and jams, as well as in folk medicine for treatment of rheumatism, headaches, and fever. And the last image here in the bottom center is of a stoneware storage vessel, one of the most well-represented types of ceramics we found at the Wilson house. These are significant because they were the Tupperware of the 19th century. They were the containers of choice for pickled, salted, and fermented foods, the major ways to preserve food in the days before reliable refrigeration. Stoneware is durable and it's impervious to leaking and doesn't need to be glazed on the inside like earthenware. And this is important for safe food storage because the acids in foods, in certain foods, especially pickled foods, can decompose lead-based glazes that were used at the time and cause lead poisoning. So these stonewares were thus the ideal receptacles to store foods raised in the village or gathered or fished nearby. And archaeologist Meredith B has examined stoneware storage vessels across a number of 19th century sites and has argued that these vessels are really significant, especially when combined with land ownership. Families who owned their own land and could invest in it and how they decided to use it. And by meeting their dietary needs with food they raised themselves and being able to store food for times of scarcity, they were better positioned to invest money in other endeavors like buying more land or tools or goods for leisure or recreation, and also sparing their children from full-time agricultural work and being able to send them to school. Right? Documentary records show that the Wilsons owned their land and they sent all of their children who were old enough to school, as did almost all of their neighbors in Seneca Village. In contrast, fewer African-American children who lived downtown were able to attend school. 2 slate pencils found in the remains of the Wilsons' house are tangible traces of their investment in education, something that was valued by both the Black and white middle class in the 19th century and essential for upward mobility. And you can see an image of one of those slate pencils on the top left of this slide. Other artifacts from the Wilson household suggest they also adhered to emerging middle-class norms about hygiene. In the 19th century, washing the body and teeth frequently and instilling these self-disciplinary practices in children came to be seen as very important aspects of respectability and middle-class identity. For African Americans and immigrants, a visibly clean appearance might have been even more important than for native-born whites because of intersectional, racial, or ethnic, in the case of the Irish, and class-based prejudices that depicted both groups as poor and dirty and therefore not respectable, with barefootedness as a key symbol. And remember, these were the tropes, poverty and dirt, that were used by the press to slander the pre-park inhabitants. The other objects on this slide speak to the Wilsons' practices related to these issues. On the left, there's a fabric and leather child shoe, just after we pulled it from the ground before we had cleaned it and conserved it. And in the middle, a bone toothbrush handle. And at the time, toothbrushes were not all that common. So having a toothbrush really sort of meant something in terms of commitment to dental hygiene. And on the right, this is a handle of a large type of pitcher called an ewer, E-U-E-R, that was used to hold water for washing up the body. The fact that the Wilson family had 9 surviving children at the time they left the village, and almost all of them were born approximately 2 years apart, suggests the village environment was healthy compared to downtown, where infant mortality rates were high. And also that the Wilsons provided good preventive care for their children through their hygienic and nutritional practices. So this is just some of the evidence that we've uncovered at Seneca Village that refutes the press's depictions of villagers and suggests that villagers were in fact largely self-sufficient and acquired objects and performed practices that would have been recognized by outsiders, if they were objective, as within middle-class norms. A closer examination of some of the artifacts from the Wilson house also suggests practices that might have been recognized by insiders as culturally African Americans. For example, while the Wilsons owned matching white plain dishes, like the kind I showed you before from the Phillips and the Webster's yard that were popular among the white middle class, they also had plates in blue printed designs that did not match. Archaeologists often note finding non-matching dishes in African-American households, and some have suggested that this was a result of limited financial resources, in which families could only afford to buy a dish or 2 at a time instead of a whole matching set all at once. But instead of treating the practices of the white middle class, buying matching all white sets as normative, and the Wilsons' assemblage as a sort of failed attempt to meet that norm, we feel that the Wilsons might have had different ideas about how to best set their table. As noted by anthropologist Alice Baldwin Jones, who's a member of our Seneca Village Advisory Board, in some African-American diasporic communities in more recent times, each individual had their own plate. plates couldn't match because then it would be impossible to know whose plate was whose. Archaeologist Lori Wilkie, who's worked on African-American sites in the South, has further postulated that some families chose to use non-matching plates as a way of acknowledging the individuality of each family member within a context that dehumanized people of African descent. And that would, I think, fit also within Bell Hooks's ideas of home place. Another somewhat unusual aspect of the Wilson ceramic assemblage as compared with middle-class white households in New York City that have been excavated archaeologically was that it contained a larger percentage of small bowls, and some of those that you see here on this slide. On the one hand, having lots of bowls might reflect a practical strategy. At the time they were forced to leave their home, the Wilsons were a family of 11, including 4 children under the age of 9. Charlotte Wilson, Mrs. Wilson, might have used these bowls to serve soft foods to her young children and to economically feed her large family with soups and stews that would have made good use of the variety of animal parts that I spoke about that we found archaeologically, parts that are not typically used for chops or roasts. On the other hand, following Maria Franklin and other African-American scholars who've studied African-American foodways and the importance of flavorful stews of vegetables or grains garnished with meat within African diasporic cuisine, we feel it's important to consider that these bowls might also, or alternatively, indicate that the Wilsons were participating in that culinary tradition and perhaps asserting an African diasporic identity through their food. Moreover, the presence of animal parts frequently used in stews, also in the backyard between the Webster and the Phillips house, suggests that they too might have recognized and shared these food customs. And we might imagine that sort of the sharing of meals was one of the many possible things that brought families in the village together. Our ongoing research into the origins of Seneca villagers has revealed more diversity within the village than has been previously known. So it's important to sort of think about the kinds of things that might have brought people together in community. So what I mean by diversity is that in addition to the European immigrants that I mentioned who became part of the village in the 1840s, who had been mostly born in Ireland and a few in Germany, the African-American villagers who made up the majority of the community had been born in 4 different New York counties, 8 different states, and 1 had been born outside of the US in Haiti. Some had been born free and others born enslaved, and thus they brought a variety of different experiences and perspectives to the village. There were also a diversity of economic situations among villagers that are reflected in the values that census takers assessed their properties. There were different kinds of household compositions ranging from the newlywed couple, the Phillips, to the large family, the Wilsons, to all kinds of situations in between, extended families, families who took in children or grandparents, and so on and so forth. And also people with different areas of interest and expertise, including gardeners, cooks, preachers, teachers, a seamstress, a shoemaker, a cooper, a shopkeeper, a policeman, and more. So our research has really only begun to scratch the surface of the history of Seneca Village and the experiences of the people who live there. But at the very least, we're confident that our findings so far, of which I was only able to offer you a small taste tonight, show that Seneca Village was a thriving, diverse, majority African-American community. Families were not squatters, but owners, such as the Wilsons, or legitimate renters, and they skillfully made productive use of land and local resources, which made them less dependent on city markets that were largely controlled by whites. Relative self-sufficiency and access to homegrown food, combined with the healthier environment of the village and residents' expertise in areas such as gardening, fishing, animal husbandry, and food storage, appears to have contributed to the good health of at least some of the village's families. Fragments of dishes and other material culture also show that villagers were aware of broader middle-class taste and values, but that families such as the Wilsons, Websters, and Phillipses constructed their homes on their own terms. And they seem to have chose African diasporic practices in their kitchens. And I'm happy to talk about any and all of this during the Q&A. But I'd also, before I conclude, I'd like to briefly address three larger points connecting Seneca Village's past to the present, to sort of speak to the issue of why should this matter to us today? There are a lot of reasons, but I'll talk about three. First, Seneca Village was only one of many communities in the US that's been destroyed for quote unquote the public good. And minority communities, particularly African-American communities, historically have borne the brunt of these endeavors. Second, this fact, coupled with other discriminatory employment and real estate practices, have resulted in far fewer Blacks than whites being able to reap the benefits of property ownership, including securing loans to start businesses and send kids to college or pass wealth on to descendants. Reduced property ownership over generations has been cited as the leading cause of the staggering wealth inequality today between Blacks and whites in the US. And lastly, stories that have been told in the press and other sources that denigrate majority Black communities and other minority communities, including Seneca Village, have made this situation possible. These stories have contained different details at different times, but they all rely on the same negative tropes. So I hope that the evidence that I've shared tonight about this one slandered community not only acknowledges the dignity of Seneca villagers and shows how the past matters, but also encourages us to question negative stories that we hear today about communities that are not our own. And that it prompts us to look for evidence and for insiders' perspectives that help us to recognize our shared humanity and to foster greater understanding and to promote greater equity. So thank you. And again, for some more information, I think this will be posted in the chat if it hasn't already. I encourage you to visit the New York Archaeological Repository's website. The repository is where all city-owned archaeological collections are housed, and they have a very robust website that includes archaeological reports and photographs of artifacts and maps and all kinds of things. And also the website of the Central Park Conservancy. The Central Park Conservancy has really been conducting a lot of their own research about the landscape, led by Marie Warsh and John Reddick. There is a wonderful exhibition of signs within the landscape of the village itself that you can learn about more on the website. And you can also go and visit the site of the village on the west side in Central Park, between approximately 83rd Street and 88th Street. You'll see lots of different signs that tell you about the village and the archaeological work that's been done there and the historical research. And the IESVH, that project of which the large research organization that I'm a part of, we are building a new website, which will share all of our research and resources. And that is coming soon, so stay tuned. I'll share that with Roxy and the staff at the Latimer House as soon as it's available. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to chatting with you, hearing your questions and responding to them. And I guess I'll stop the share now. Should I stop the share?
Yeah, for now. Thank you, Meredith, for your presentation. And we actually have a number of questions. I wanted to flag that there is a question in the answered section. I am not sure if you're able to see it, but it's a question from Francie. But we also have 4 other questions. So I'm going to ask if, let me see if I can, and I know some folks might be on the phone and not able to speak. So I will now unmute so then maybe folks can speak up. I also see there is a comment by Tina as well in the chat. She says, it seems the families didn't have time to pack their belongings during this time. Do you have information on where the villagers moved to? So that, I think, is in relation to another question about what is that community today, who lives there now? But then before all of that, I want to make space for Francie if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you all so much again, and we'll try to get to all of the questions. Francie, are you able to? Okay.
Yes, thank you, Roxy. Thank you so much, Doctor, for that outstanding presentation and the enormity and the significance of the work you have been doing, both in terms of New York's past history, its present, and how it advises us about public policy and interrelationships between groups, as all are immigrants in New York, sooner or later. So with that said, Dr. Linn, there were two individuals who emerged out of one, I think, was born in the so-called Nanny Goat Village, George Washington Plunkett. He became a major leader in the Tammany political club, which existed in New York through the early 1960s. And he was what we would characterize now as a district leader in the Hell's Kitchen area. And there was another individual, Richard Croker, who became a Tammany boss from 1886 to 1901. So, Dr. Linn, I have two questions. What community, if any, in raw political terms, was created by the African American and the overwhelmingly Irish immigrant population who lived alongside each other in that latter half, so to speak, of the 20th century, within the village for the amount of time that they did? Was there any commonwealth or merging of political aspirations through a political lens? So that's my first question. And I asked that notwithstanding the fact that I'm very well aware that there's significant scholarship, research, etc., that would suggest that the question itself is absurd because both groups were pitted against one another and were at each other's throats, as occurred downtown in the so-called 5 spaces. So that's my first question. Did Blacks and Irish immigrants form any political community that impacted either or both standing within the Tammany Hall apparatus for political favor, political gain? And then my second question, by the 1910s, the script was flipped, and suddenly Irish American, especially Irish American immigrant women, were looking to marry up. And by marrying up, they married African American men who were already living in the United States, and many of whom had benefited, and certainly their heirs had benefited, from the legal system in the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, such that the white Irish immigrant woman was truly marrying up because the African American man that she would marry and create a family with had an established political, societal, social, and economic lineage
Francine, sorry to interrupt, but I think maybe we can let Dr. Linn answer your first question, because I see that it also links to some of the other questions that folks have, and then maybe we can get to the second question, just because we're running a little short on time. Sorry, I want to get to everyone's questions, but thank you so much for your questions, and yeah.
Thanks, Roxy, and thanks, Francie, for your excellent questions. I pulled up the slides again to show you Summit Rock over here. Do you see this on the top left of the slide? This was one of the highest points in Seneca Village, and we think it's what was referred to as Nanny Goat Hill, where George Washington Plunkett was supposedly born, or at least that's what his biographers say. One of the outstanding questions we have about Seneca Village is what were the relationships between Irish villagers and African-American villagers like? Because as you pointed out, downtown there was a lot of animosity between the two groups. There were wedges that were forced between the two, competing for some of the same jobs. There was a lot of violence, particularly Irish immigrants inflicted mostly on African-Americans. So we are very curious about what the relationship between Irish and African-American villagers were like. So far, we only have a few clues. I mean, on the one hand, we have no evidence that there was animosity, that there was discord. However, we are not naive to think that the village was a total utopia, and I'm sure that people had neighborly disagreements from time to time. There are a couple of artifacts that suggest maybe some relationships between the two. So I'm pulling up this slide that shows you the location of the Wilson house. And this curious artifact that we found, which took us a while to figure out what it was. And in fact, it was an undergraduate at Columbia who leaned over when we were working in the lab and said, "Oh, that's a curry comb." And we said, "A what?" And she said, "Oh, it's a curry comb. I work with horses, and this is a tool that you use to comb horses." And we thought, oh, wow, okay. I mean, and that's just one example of illustrating why having a diverse team of people who bring different experience and different points of view to a project is really useful, because we might have never figured out what this thing was. And so, but a question is, why would Mr. Wilson have a curry comb? Because if you look at maps of the village, Mr. Wilson didn't have a stable or a barn or a place to keep a horse. But most of the barns and the stables that were in the village were owned by Irish residents. There was an African-American family, the Landons, who lived over here, who did have a barn. But this curry comb kind of brings up the possibility that maybe the Wilsons were boarding a horse in an Irish-American villager's house. And one of the contestants for that is the Gallaghers, who lived up here, kind of the closest Irish family to the Wilsons. Mr. Gallagher was a shoemaker. And in fact, some of the other kind of curious things that we found in the Wilson house was a bunch of shoe soles. So kind of extra leather soles to shoes with holes punched in them, but not sewn to anything. So, perhaps a connection between those two families. Additionally, and I want to answer this quickly to get on to other questions, but there's a really tangible, a really kind of tantalizing trace in the documentary records, and this speaks to where people went after the village was dispersed. So as I mentioned, the Wilsons moved further to the west side with All Angels Church. Some families moved further east into Yorkville, which had an African-American community there. Some moved north into Harlem. Others moved to Queens or to New Jersey. Some of them, if you find them in census records, there are other African-American families living nearby them. In other cases, it seems like they chose places that were more agricultural, like places where they could grow crops and raise animals and be kind of on their own. But there is a record of two young men who grew up in the village, one as neighbors, both around the same age. One was Irish, one was African-American. And in 1870, they're both working in the same farm in Bergen County, New Jersey. So there's a possibility that that's evidence of sustained kind of bonds between two villagers who, had they lived downtown, might not have had a positive relationship with one another. So I hope that answers the question. I'm not an expert on Tammany Hall and the politics. I mean, one of the things that archaeology tends to, of residential sites like Seneca Village, tends to answer more questions about daily practices and ordinary habits, right? We look towards the historical records, the documentary records, to tell us more about kind of political involvement, because those records tend to capture that. And certainly there were alliances between some African Americans and Tammany Hall politicians, but I'm not all that familiar with the details. Does that answer things?
Actually, I think that answers a lot of the questions, because I think we also had the question of whether like immigrants and African Americans at the time lived like, next to each other. And there was a question about whether, where they moved to. So I feel you definitely answered those. We do have a few more questions. There's one I think should be really quick. There's a question from Julie asking, did the designers of the park and political leaders help the residents find new housing, or were they left to do it themselves? Which I think, yeah, so I think that answers the question, Julie. Yeah,
they were left to do it themselves. And so the only kind of documents that are written by Seneca villagers themselves, or by a scribe who helped them write, because not all of the adults in the village were literate, do pertain to protesting the amount of money they were offered for their land. And they say things like, I was offered twice as much for my property last year. I've invested all of this money into cultivating the land or building an orchard, and so on and so forth. But we don't know if any of those letters were successful in helping them to gain more money. And there's no evidence that the city helped people find new housing. One thing that we do know from records from the Parks Conservancy, from sort of Central Park records, is that it seems that homeowners were allowed to take their homes with them. They could, if they had the means, lift them up off of their foundations and carry them somewhere else. And that, in fact, was done with All Angels Church. Actually, I'll show you this slide here. There are only 2 images of people or things that had existed in the village. On the left, you see part of All Angels Church, the wooden superstructure that was actually lifted up off its foundations in Seneca Village and carried a few blocks to the west. Unfortunately, that church building burned down in a fire within a couple of decades. But the All Angels Parish still exists. It's right near Zabar's, actually, on the Upper West Side. And many of the church records exist there, so baptismal records, marriage records, and so on. And those are actually also very good for giving us some sense of the relationship between villagers, between African-American villagers, and also between African-American and Irish villagers. There is evidence of some intermarriage between those two groups. There is evidence of people serving as witnesses at marriages for people of a different race. And then on the right, we have one portrait of one of the landowners and residents, Levin Smith, who was a trustee of the AME Zion Church.
We have a couple of questions, but I'll try to summarize. So there is one question that asks more about the origins of how folks ended up in Seneca Village. So this question is from Peter. He asks, how did people from so many states, both free and slave, end up there? And then there's also a kind of series of questions about the kind of present day efforts. Clement asked the question, is there a movement to make restitution to descendants as they have in California with the Bruce family, I believe? And then to that point, there is another question by Diana that asks, does the New York Historical Society have any role at this time? So I think that the last 2 questions are connected in terms of the present day efforts, but I want to see if any of those questions call to you, and feel free to answer them.
Yeah, okay, so how did people end up there? On the one hand, land that was available for African Americans to purchase in New York was limited because of cost and because of racism. Real estate was really expensive, and not everyone would sell to African Americans, even if they had the money. But Seneca Village the majority of the land that became Seneca Village was owned by a white family called the Whiteheads. And they had owned a big parcel of farmland that they decided to divide up and sell off as individual lots. And this was something that people did at the time in order to make money. And we're not exactly sure, why the Whiteheads were open to selling land to African Americans, but it is interesting that Mr. Whitehead was a cartman. Cartmen were people who moved goods throughout the city. They had a special license. They were also often politically connected. And later on, and licenses were limited to whites. They were not available for African Americans. But later on, Andrew Williams, that first landowner in the village who I mentioned, first African American man to purchase land in the village, became a cartman. So there might have been some kind of cartman political connection where Mr. Whitehead said, hey, I have this land that I want to sell. And then it kind of circulated through the Black community, first with people associated with the AME Zion Church, and then with other Black churches, majority Black churches downtown. All of the, people were very connected within the Black churches. They knew each other. It wasn't, New York City was a big city and it was densely settled, but it was still small enough that a lot of people knew each other. And so word could spread fast. In terms of how do people from various states end up in New York, lots of people self-emancipated. Of course, not everybody could, but there were many people who made an attempt to come into New York and were able to stay there. And Seneca Village, there are documents that tell us that members of the AME Zion Church and the African Union Church were active in abolitionist efforts and were probably part of the Underground Railroad. So we have, the Underground Railroad was a secret thing. So it makes sense that we have no smoking gun that says that Seneca Village was a stop on the railroad, but it fits kind of the profile of Underground Railroad stops in that it's a little bit out of the way, out of this, the center part of the city where it was a place where people could be hidden without being noticed. The topography of the landscape with this high elevation in the southern part of the city and other hills kind of helped to obscure residents living there, giving them a little bit of privacy. There was a reservoir, the Croton Reservoir, the reservoir that supplies drinking water today to the city, that was built in the 1830s, that formed the eastern boundary of the city with 25-foot high walls that would also kind of shelter the city from views. So it might be that that people ended up in the village as a result of the abolitionist efforts of residents or members of the AME Church. There were lots of people like the Lyons family, who were known abolitionists, who didn't live in Seneca Village, but they owned land there, and who would have been knowledgeable about the community. So that's sort of some hypotheses about how people from all over ended up there. In terms of current day efforts, so one of the things that members of the IESVH have been doing in collaboration with the Parks Conservancy is really trying to educate the public about the village. And one of our goals is to try to advocate for a permanent commemoration on the site. So right now, I mentioned there is a whole program of signage that's really informative and helpful in at the village site that the Conservancy has installed, but it's temporary. Again, with the goal of kind of raising awareness, educating people, so there could be a larger public discussion and a call for artists to submit proposals for a permanent commemoration. We've not broached the subject as a group of restitution, but I know that there are members of the IESVH who are very interested in issues of restitution. In terms of descendants, that's long been a puzzle. So it's only recently that we've come into contact. We've been very fortunate to come into contact with the descendants of Andrew Williams, again, that first landowner. It's kind of fitting that the first person to purchase land in the village, it's his descendants that we have been able to get in touch with first. So So we do have some descendants now who've supplied us with a little bit more information about the Williams family. Branches of their family ended up in California and in New Jersey. There's a whole really interesting history of the Williams family, including descendants who served in the military and who became a music teacher, and all kinds of things that are, and some of that information is actually posted on the Central Parks Conservancy website that I mentioned that's here. There's a video that shows an interview between Cal Jones, one of our advisory board members and former borough historian of Manhattan, in conversation with Ariel Williams, one of the Williams descendants. Oh, and then New York Historical Society. Yes, I mean, New York Historical Society has long been interested. You know, their library is fantastic, and they hold a lot of important information, maps, and so on that are useful for researching the village. And they've hosted fellows who have been researching Seneca Village. So yes, the Historical Society is involved as well.
I think that's all the time we have tonight, but thank you, Dr. Linn, for answering everyone's questions. I did see that someone was looking for a part 2 to the talk, so hopefully, you know, we can, you know, and I'm sure Dr. Linn are giving more talks in the future. But yeah, if you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider joining us for the next talk. We'll be talking about the history of the Hills community in Westchester, New York with Dr. Eugene Bosch on August 18th at the same time at 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. EST. Our intern will now share, as you can see, the links in the chat to the next event, as well as the links to our museum, the Lewis Latimer House Museum, and our partner, the Bird Homestead and Meeting House Conservancy. And of course, the links that Dr. Linn mentioned about Central Park Conservancy and also the archaeological repository page. So we hope these resources are useful to all of you. And you know, a recording of this video will be up on YouTube, so we'll be sharing that after the event. And with that, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Linn, for this amazing talk, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.